Okay, so middleman, intermediary relationships. Anybody else?
Intermediary to me is agents within the same brokerage, but it has to be, of course, signed by the brokers. So the broker would assign two particular agents, I guess, depending on skill level, however the broker decides it, but that has to be determined by the broker, if that's something allowed.
Okay, all right, love it. Good talking point.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, the one broker, two agents, one working with the seller, one working with the buyer, and the broker in between.
Okay, okay. You just keep that out there. All right, so the form itself, you guys are hitting it on the head. The form itself is this intermediary relationship notice that has to be signed by the potential buyer client or seller client, right? In this case, we're going to get into this form. This form is not too hard to fill out, but more importantly than the form almost is making sure how we form the intermediary relationship the proper way. There's some confusion sometimes because we can have an intermediate relationship with appointments and without appointments, okay? And I want to break both of those down to make sure you know what is what in the scenario. And I'm going to highlight a couple of things, and don't laugh at my stick figures over here, but I'm going with the stick figure guys for the purposes of this training. Let me close this out. Comes in late. Gotta keep on admitting people. All right, let's go into slide that presentation here. Okay, so we have a happy seller there. They look very happy, correct? Mm-hmm. And the home is listed by a war team person, right? And everyone in the war team, when it's listed by someone in the war team at that given time, everyone represents the seller, okay? Because the intermediate relationship and the agency agreement is created at what level? The broker level. So any house that we get in here, if you step inside of that house at that given time and you're doing an open house, you represent the seller at that time. Whether you had the listing agreement signed, because guess who? The broker represents the seller. So that's where it's really formed at. So any listing we have, you go out, show it, you do anything, whatever, at the time, whatever, unless you, there's something, and I shouldn't say go show it, but if you're in the open house and you're standing there and somebody walks in, you represent the seller, okay? Now, let's say you're the listing agent now, right? You're the actual listing agent, right? And you have a signed agreement with a seller. And interested buyer calls you on the phone, drives past the property, sees the sign, right? And calls you up, right? At that, you're the professional, you're the trained person. Trek is saying, hey, look, you guys need to know exactly how to establish the agency agreement. And again, in this world of express agency and implied agency, and after the fact, we could talk about all those things. But in the big picture, the Trek saying, hey, look, you guys should know how to establish agency. And whether it's in person or over the phone, if you're the listing agent, there's a couple different things, key questions that you probably should ask on the phone or in person if you're the listing agent, for sure. And some of those questions are going to be, are you represented by an agent? Now, we have a series of questions when people call, hey, how you been seeing homes or whatever this looks, but one of the key elements, the critical elements in forming the intermediate relationship is establishing if that consumer is represented or not represented. Everybody with me? Because that's going to dictate your next moves, okay? So if you don't ask that, in the world of Texas Real Estate Commission, they're going to see that as a negligence on your part, that you didn't do that, right? Now, if you're not the listing agent, you get the call, you still have to do that. And there's critical things that can happen if you don't do that properly as well today. But especially if you're a listing agent now, you have to. You got to sit there and say, okay, you represent, not represent, because we got to figure this thing out. Because I already have a signed agreement with the seller. Okay, I have the level of fiduciary responsibility to the seller here already. That's already up there. The highest level that you can give this person or this client is already here. Okay, so when you look at it from that perspective, that angle, what I'm trying to establish here as you as a listing agent is to make sure you asking the critical questions, because I think that's how things start to get messed up, because we don't establish agency, or lack of agency, I should say, in the conversation, especially as listing agents. All right. So let's say you ask all the critical questions, and in this case, and I think my scenario goes a little bit further here. Slide here. Ask critical questions. All right. Listing agent needs to explain at that time that he or she, they or them, whatever your pronouns are, right? The seller, explain to them, hey, look, they represent the seller. Hey, I represent the seller right now. That's what I do. If they wanted to go forward in any way, capacity, shape, or form, yeah, they could go forward unrepresented. That's a fact. But they will stay a customer, not a client. It is possible. Now, if that happened, and that's the scenario, is that intermediary?
No.
It is not. It's not, because we've clearly established that who in the agency agreement, who we represent in that process. Listing agent says, hey, I represent the seller. Hey, the buyer says, okay, look, I don't need an agent, blah, 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 and I'm good. I understand I'm a customer. If that was the scenario, there's certain forms that I want you to send. You would send over the information about broker services to this particular buyer, right? This customer. And also now we would send over the new form. What we would send over? The one that just came out. The unrepresented show, what's it called? The unrepresented showing notice. Okay. You would send that over, because that clearly says, hey, the NOA, you don't negotiate, you don't give opinions, and you don't give advice. Okay. So information about broker services and the NOA, the unrepresented showing notice. Those would be the proper way to form this and not establish any intermediary relationship. With me? Okay. Any questions from virtual land on that one? Okay, we're gonna keep on moving. We got a happy seller again. Home listed by a war team person, still the same scenario. Everyone represents the brokerage. You got the super agent as a list agreement. Interested buyer calls the office or calls you somehow, right? In this scenario, you're not the person that receives this call, or whatever case may be. You're not the listing agent. You're just another agent in the office. And if you got a call somehow, whatever, another super buyer's agent now. Okay. You still go with the questions and ask the questions and all this other stuff. You're supposed to establish agency, right? You're not the listing agent. You're trying to become who? The buyer's agent. That's what you're trying to do. Again, buyer agent needs to ask the right questions. Buyer's agent needs to get a representation agreement signed. And then in this case, it's an actual full-blown representation, short form or long form, establishing that you are the agent, right? Before putting an offer on the house, escape. Before putting an offer on the house, you get the buyer rep agreement signed, you get all that signed, right? Before putting the offer on the house, the next steps in this process is now we have to fill out the intermediary relationship notice. The sequence of events matters, right? The sequence of events matters. You cannot put in this scenario, you should not have put an offer in on the property and then establish the intermediate relationship notice. And there's where we mess up. That's a lot of times in the brokerage or whatever, we mess up that simple process. Now I'm going to talk about how to fill out this form, but it's important to know when this form is inserted into the process. Okay. It's really critical that it's inserted prior to the offer. Because why we need to insert this prior to the offer. We got to notify that the buyer, telling the buyer, hey, yeah, I do represent you and I represent you. Yep. And this would be the example. It happens automatically. It's not like I'm going out there and say, hey, Michael, you're appointed to the seller. Hey, Desiree, you're appointed to the buyer. I don't do that. That's not happening. But on paper, it's happening because the appointments are happening with this document being filled out. I probably never even know, but it's happening by appointment right there, right? The appointment is happening, whatever case may be. When you get the sign, send it over, it's got to be that way. And then from there, that's when you can submit the offer to the listing agent because everything's been established. The buyer knows that, hey, this is in our office, which is what this form is saying. Hey, this property is in our office. It's listed on the broker, right? And I'm being appointed to the buyer and the listing agent is being appointed to the seller, which is happening. And now you guys know that this is under one umbrella. We're in the same office and we're establishing this intermediate relationship, but you have representation for the buyer and the seller still has representation from the listing agent. Okay. And there's where a lot of times people get it really messed up right there. The sequence of events. With me on that one?
On the listing agreement, the seller has to agree.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second. All right. Which probably a great segue into it. Now, this is assuming that the listing agent's list agreement has intermediary already checked off. All right. So the only way that you're going to know that, there's no other way to know that unless you pick up the phone and call the listing agent and say, hey, look, did your seller allow intermediary relationships in the listing agreement? All right. Now, call the listing agent to do that. And I'm telling you why. Because I've had several listings where sellers are savvy and they're like, no, we do not want no intermediary relationships in the transaction of our sale of our house. I've had several, right? Now, I also had one that he signed that and he was adamant about it. But we had two agents bring an offer to the table. And I was like, yo, we ain't got nothing from nobody else. We got two of our agents bringing offers. Are you sure you want to stay in this no intermediary relationship? He quickly changed his mind. Yeah. Okay. So even though I would tell you if I was in that situation, I was a listing agent and I had an agent saying I'm not the broker, like I'm not the broker. And if I was a listing agent and offers was being presented by people in my brokerage and the seller had signed that they didn't want intermediary relationships, I would turn around and ask me, hey, I just got an offer from such and such. They're in our brokerage or they want to present an offer. Are you open to it? Okay. Are you open to having this offer? Then I need to go back to amend my listing agreement, change that to, hey, now we're going to allow intermediate relationships, right? And we have them sign this. And now everything's above board. And now we can receive those offers. Okay. It's a paper shuffle to the most part, but it does matter. And it matters in the way of how we form it. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Now let's talk about without appointment. Okay. without appointment. Typically without appointment, there's probably scenarios where you're in a very small brokerage or something like that. There's no other options, right? And or you're agent by yourself in some brokerage, which it does happen. There's offices of one, office of two. And you have a listing and the buyer comes in and wants to act on that particular house. Again, the agency agreement is at the broker level. And if you're the listing agent, there's no other agent, and the buyer comes to you as the listing agent, now the broker can do this without appointment, meaning that this agent here now goes in a capacity of not giving any NOA. They won't negotiate, they won't give opinions, and they won't give advice to either party. So that's without appointment. Now, the way I want you guys to do it, the way I prefer to do it with the limited, will minimize risk, minimize liability. In those cases, if you're the listing agent, I think I've said this many times, as a listing agent, to this day, if a buyer came in unrepresented, first-time home buyer, I would not facilitate the deal. I would still put someone else with that buyer, because there's no way that I feel like a first-time home buyer is not going to need negotiations, they're not going to need opinions, and they're not going to need advice. And I cannot do that and keep the fiduciary responsibility to my seller up here. So that's the reason I've always said it's better to get 4.5 than get 6 and have a lawsuit. Because if that does happen, you came in and you told me that, I would probably say, hey, let's find an agent in the office. You split that, you acquired the buyer, so there's, you deserve payment. So let's split that up half and half. We get another agent in the office, right? You're totally disconnected from that buyer now, right? And the buyer is with another agent, but if the deal closed, you get 50% of that commission. And now you're in no way, shape, or form violating any of this stuff out here that Trex try to make sure that we don't violate. That's the best scenario to me. Now, have I been in situations where investor or savvy buyer, hey, look, or affluent buyer, nah, I don't need no agent. I'm gonna have my attorneys look at all this stuff. I've been in that situation. They just send me the contract. I'll have my attorneys look at it. Cool. I've done that and still gave them, hey, clearly I represent the seller. I do not represent you. You're just a customer. And literally on that side of the house, I'm just a high paid data entry person on the contract. That's it. No advice, no opinions, no negotiation, excuse me. So those are very unique situations. Not saying it can't happen. You have to gauge that at the time. You have to tell me and say, hey, look, this guy's this, they don't want nothing, whatever case may be. Okay, roll with it. Okay, roll with it. But if it's not, and the minute the buyer starts asking you all these crazy questions and you're the listing agent, you're gonna be like, no, you need representation. If they're asking you questions that are gonna tilt the scale towards the buyer and you represent the seller, you've already done something wrong already. And if you even have a question of that, okay, hey, you're the listing agent. Hey, do I get an inspection? What should I do?
Can't tell you.
At that moment in time, you probably need to set there, hey, you need an agent. Let me get somebody for you. Okay. That's all I say. Just keep it simple. All right. Just keep it simple. Questions from anybody else out there? Melinda, you there?
Hi, Ben. I have a question.
Oh, that's not Melinda. Sonia, what's up? How you doing?
I'm doing good on yourself. So what if the buyer says, okay, I do need representation so we can proceed because I need advice, but the seller is refusing to pay the fee, the realtor fee. So that's when you have to talk to them and say, this is going to be the fee that you have to pay at closing?
No. So in your agreement, in the listing agreement, I'm assuming that you're saying you're the listing agent, right?
Yes. No,
Okay.
mainly like the customer, the one that doesn't want representation, and then, oh, I do need an agent. But then I guess I could be the listing agent, yes. That I know that that the seller is refusing to pay basically a commission for the buyer's agent.
Well, and so here's the thing. Let's go back over here. It's better for me to show you than to just tell you. Let's go right to. Okay, so if you're the listing agent, and let's imagine that you had put when earned and payable, seller will pay broker the total amount of broker and not other broker, and other broker, the total amount. And let's say you have put 6% here in 5A1A.
Okay.
Okay. And in this case, your seller saying, hey, I'm not going to pay the other broker, correct?
Yes.
It says other broker would get 3% here, but this agreement says here, I'm going to highlight this. The scenario we're talking about says broker will retain amounts and specified in 5A1 as broker fee if there is no other broker that procures the buyer, including two, not limited to, I should say, transactions where the broker represents both the seller and buyer, intermediary, or buyers unrepresented. That amount here is still retained. So what I'm saying is that the seller already signed the agreement saying that they're going to pay 6%, right? Most likely, hopefully,
Yes.
because that's what we charge. And there is no other broker in the scenario. So if there is no other broker in the scenario, because it's only, remember, it's only me as the broker.
Right.
It's saying whatever the amount is here is being kept, is that's what they're agreeing to pay. So what I do after the fact with the 6%, give it to agent X or give it to agent Y, give it to agent Z, whatever, is up to my business of what I do. So
Okay.
your seller already established that they're paying 6%. Now, if another broker was involved, the reason you want to keep this in-house is because of that reason right there. Because if there's no
makes
other
sense.
broker involved, we're saying, hey, we're retaining 5A1. And then I disperse accordingly based upon that. Now, if you go outside to get another broker and another agent from someplace else, you procure this buyer and you say, hey, I don't want to use nobody in the war team, and I go get someone else from a different brokerage. Now it says if the other broker procures a buyer, because that's what would be happening, another broker outside of the brokers would be procuring it, this amount is supposed to be paid. That amount right there is really negotiable for the seller at that point in time. Okay, so keep that in mind when you do your listing agreements, and make sure you explain it the right way, because that comes up often, right? Comes up often. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Ben, I was on mute.
No, I wanted to make sure you was there because I know we've come up with a couple of situations with in Melinda problems out there
Yeah,
with
I'm
this.
here.
Okay. Okay. Questions about this? So all these agreements matter. The buyer's representation agreement matters to this whole intermediary relationship notice. The listing agreement matters with this whole thing. And trust me, a lot of people don't look at this from this detailed area, right? So you got to understand. So as you, and it helps how you form your conversation with somebody. It helps how you approach the buyer. It helps how you approach the seller in scenarios. Because you may get that seller like, oh, no, I'm not paying. I'm like, okay, yes, you are. Because it says here in the agreement that that's what it says. That's what we agreed to. Now, I would make sure I explain it to the seller properly. I don't want to be sleazy. I explain this to the seller. Like, hey, there's no other broker involved. We're still retaining 5A1. Okay. All right, let's go to the form itself. Oh, I had some scenarios. I wrote down some more scenarios before we go into this. Okay, scenario. What did I write down here? Got some scenarios for you guys. Okay, some best practices when you doing this. I wrote some stuff down here. Always use TREC forms or TR forms. All right, make sure you use the information about broker services and make sure you're using the intermediate relationship notice that we're going to talk about here in a second. Explain what intermediary relationships are and what they are not. Be very clear with that, right? Explain some of the benefits to it. And also, is there cautions with it? And the reason there's cautions with it, why do you guys think that this even came about? Why do you think TREC formed this or made this form?
Everybody understands what's happening with the transaction.
Transparency. But in order for us to arrive here to have this form, guess what used to happen before this?
So we just word of mouth. We were on the phone.
No, agents in the office would be saying, hey, look, my seller will take this. And when all the stuff was compromising integrity and stuff like that. For us to get to this form, there was some bad stuff going on. Okay. That's what I'm getting at. So we don't really do that here. There's nothing that when we brief and we talk about listings, everybody's above board. We say, hey, this is the price. Hey, motivated, whatever. We don't get out there. They'll take, what that was going on in the past. All right. Or
basically upfront, everything's in right front.
Correct. Or, hey, Tanisha's the listing agent. Desiree's the buyer's agent. She get the buyer, and all of a sudden she says, hey, Desiree, hey, look, write the offer for X. Because I know my seller will accept it. You see what I'm saying? I know y'all not thinking like that, but devious minds would think like that, right? We separate with integrity, right? So that's why this was formed, right? So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. All right, let's some other stuff I wrote down. Scenarios. I got some scenarios here. Went to Chat GPT. Got some scenarios. Okay, broker ABC employs 2 agents. They only have 2 agents on their roster, Agent Lisa and Agent Tom. Lisa represents the seller, Tom brings the buyer. Since both are signed with the broker, ABC, and both give written consent, broker ABC can act as intermediary with appointments. All right. Lisa can be appointed to seller, Tom can be appointed to buyer, and we can proceed on with the advice of their clients. All right. Scenario number 2. Agent Maria is a solo agent in a small brokerage. She represents a seller through a signed listing agreement. A buyer calls her directly after seeing the listing on Zillow. Maria already has a buyer representation with them already. Since Maria is the only agent, her broker cannot make appointments. With written consent, the broker can act as intermediary without appointments and written consent. And this is what we would do for written consent without appointment, right? Maria must remain neutral, cannot give any negotiation advice, opinions, or anything to help either side. All right. Agent John sells both the buyer and the seller that he represents them both and proceeds without any written intermediary consent or disclosure. He gives advice to both sides, negotiate terms, and gives his opinion to both the seller and the buyer. This is illegal in Texas. Texas does not allow undisclosed or unregulated dual agency agreements. Okay, we good? Crystal clear? Okay, let's get into the form itself, or what we came here for. Good, I think I had it open here, didn't I? Okay, first thing it says, hey, look, this Texas Realtor form, all right? Use of this form by persons who are not members of Texas Realtor Association of Realtors is not authorized. Let's stop right there. Let's stop right there. What do you think about that statement? Especially now. Anybody?
I think you need to be paying into that MLS services and then for you to use all of the form.
Correct. Oh, that's one aspect. Yeah. Yeah, that's the benefits of your association, of course. What I was getting to is, I think Karen last year had a scenario where she came in after the fact on a deal, and the consumer and the seller, who was not part of any association or not licensed or anything whatsoever, they had formed a contract and they used some of the Texas Realtors forms. And after the fact, they were trying to get Karen to come help assist. And I told her she can't do anything because they've already formed something, and this comes down to a attorney matter. You know, they formed an agreement, they got a contract. Who's to say this is legal or not legal, even though it says that up the top? Who are we to say that we ain't the attorneys or the police on these forms, right? So what my point is, if these forms are being used by people that's non-licensed or outside the association, there's really no regulatory guidance to say yay or nay, okay? And who's to say what's right? And that would only be unpacked in the justice of the peace or some type of court action or something like that. But it is up there, and sometimes that does come up. That's all I'm going to put to this, right? It says this notice does not satisfy the written consent requirement under Texas law. To act as intermediary, the broker must first obtain written consent from each party in the transaction. Got the section there. Written consent from the seller, landlord, and buyer tenant can be obtained using the applicable Texas Realtors listing and buyer representation agreements. In both agreements, it does have a blur in there about intermediary relationships, where the buyer and the seller can check off, right? I can't take it. We're going to go back there. It's a listing. Okay. So it says this form is not intended to notify the parties. This form is intended to notify the parties that the broker will act as intermediary and whether the broker will appoint associates to communicate with each parties. So that's the basis of it. Now, that's the form you need to have. And we need to do this when? Critical. We need to do this when? Before the offer. Everybody say that with me. Before the offer. Before the offer. Yes, thank you. Before the offer. All right. Before the offer. All right. It says two. Pretty simple. Seller or landlord. And to the buyer. It says from. That would be the Williams Advanced Realty team or the WAR team. Put the property address and we put the date. Okay, that's pretty much all you got to do, pretty much at this point in time. And it reads, under this notice, owner means the seller or landlord of the property, and prospect means the above name in the buyer or tenant for the property. Broker firms represents the owner under a listing agreement and also represents the prospect under the buyer tenant representation agreement. In the written listing agreement, the buyer representation agreement, both the owner and the prospect previously authorized the broker to act as intermediary in a prospect. If a prospect who brokers represents desire to buy or lease that is listed by the broker. So that's basically saying in a nutshell that prior in your listing agreement and your buyer reps agreement that they had already blessed off that they were okay with intermediary in those agreements. Everybody with me? The next sentence says, hey, now, when the prospect makes the offer to purchase or lease the property, broker will act in accordance with the authorization granted to the listing agreement and the buyer representation agreement. Now, here's where you check. Broker will in this case, or will not appoint. In this case, it'll probably be will appoint. And now whoever's assigned to the seller, that name will go in there. Tanisha to the owner, Desiree to the prospect. That's where your names will go in there. And now we have both the seller and the prospect signed. We do that first, then the offer. Okay. It also says broker compensation or sharing the compensation between brokers is not set or fixed, controlled, recommended, or suggested by Association of Realtors, MLS, or any listing services. Brokers' compensation is fully negotiable. Brokers independently determine their own fees. And we have already determined our own fee. Our fee is 6% for a listing. That's already determined. All right. Questions? No questions? All right. This is our class on intermediary relationships. That is all. No scenarios you want to throw at me? Melinda? She always comes up with some good ones.
So in the point, if they check out will not.
So this would be like, okay, will not appoint, all right? And that the scenario say, okay, if that did not appoint, Tanisha now is just not giving negotiations, advice, or opinion.
Okay.
And she would just, they both sign on, and now Tanisha's, she's a high-speed secretary. Okay. Which most times we will not do in this office. I can't really think of any scenario where I would probably do that unless it's just, I had to know this, I had to know fully about the whole thing because I would want to stay away from that. All righty, concludes the class for today. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.